The Sled. Malachi woke up to the smell of wood smoke from the kitchen. His first thought was one of surprise. Surprise that no one had come to wake him up and rouse him out of bed. It was still dark, and he had no way of knowing how late or how early it might be. The bed, which he shared with his cousin Joe, was no longer warm, for Joe had already risen to start the day. Malachi stretched out his legs, and his toes touched the bricks at the foot of the bed. As he expected, they were cool, almost cold to the touch. Cold and rough, the edges almost sharp enough to slice his foot. To think that at night the same bricks, even wrapped in flannel cloth, were so hot that his toes couldn't touch them for more than a few seconds. He wondered why no one had roused him, and he lay still for several minutes, listening to the sounds from downstairs. It was hard to understand, for it seemed as if it was only his aunt in the kitchen. There were no voices, only the occasional sound of her footsteps, or of the firebox creaking open and the dull thud of a block of wood thrown in on the fire. The bed got no warmer, and here and there he could feel sharp splinters of straw poking through the threadbare burlap of his flannel nightdress. He pushed off the heavy blankets and rolled himself out of bed. The floorboards were cold on his feet. He dressed quickly and, still barefoot, climbed down the ladder into the relative warmth of the kitchen, the large main room of the small house. "Good morning, Aunt," he said. His Aunt Rachel had her back to him, and she did not turn to look at him. "About time you were up," she said. "It's almost light out. I need water. Better fill up both pails." Malachi went to the stove, and from the cord strung above it, took down a pair of heavy wool socks. The warmth near the stove was like a call to linger. The stove had clearly been lit for some time, for the rough wool was not just dry, but warm, almost hot to the touch. With his still cold fingers, he squeezed the material, as if to take as much heat from it as he could. He tried to stretch out all his movements, removing the socks slowly and one at a time from the cord on which they hung. He glanced at his aunt before taking a chance and moving a chair a few steps closer to the stove. He sat on it and waited a long minute before pulling on one sock and then the other. Then he sat still a moment longer, aware that his failure to move quickly might earn him the sharp edge of his aunt's tongue. He noticed that the kettle on the stove was releasing its first preliminary wisps of vapor, and that the short-handled wooden spoon was protruding at a slant from the porridge pot. He wondered if the porridge hadn't already been made, and if there had been any for him. He looked at the kettle again, and it came to him that already it had been emptied once this morning. There were dirty dishes on the sideboard near the basin, as if Joe and Uncle Sean had already eaten. Again, he silently questioned where his cousin and uncle might be. Malachi stood, and, on warm-soled feet, made his way to the door. He could tell from the frost on the window that it was another cold day. As he tied the laces of his worn boots, one of them snapped. He knew better than to say anything to his aunt. As quickly as he could, he reworked the broken laces, struggling to pass it through the eyelets. In the end, he was able to tie on his boot with two shortened laces, so that only 4 of the eyelets remained empty, and the boot, already a few sizes too big, did not fall off his foot. He wrapped his scarf around his neck, and then slipped on the worn jacket that had been given to him as a winter coat. He pulled his woolen toque down over his ears and reached for his mitts. Of all his winter apparel, it was his mitts he treasured the most. They were almost new, and even though they were a few sizes too big for his small hands, they were wonderful mitts. Heavy, dark leather, lined on the inside with warm felt. They were gone. In fact, there were no mitts at all on the small shelf reserved for mitts and scarves and hats, not even the old green ones that were full of holes. "Haven't you gone yet?" his aunt yelled. "You should have been back by now. Didn't I tell you to get me 2 buckets of water, you lazy good-for-nothing?" She took 2 steps towards him, But Malachi knew, he didn't know how, but he knew that she wasn't going to cuff him. Still, he made himself smaller and avoided looking directly at her. She stopped, still a few paces from the door, and scowled at him for a moment. "If you're not back with them 2 buckets in 5 minutes, there's no breakfast for you. Is that clear?" Malachi meekly nodded. He knew, at that moment, that there was no porridge left for him. It would take him almost 5 minutes just to walk to the springs. He picked up one of the galvanized pails with his left hand, lifted the door latch with his right, and pushed open the door. Less quickly than he normally would, he took the second pail with his right hand and stepped out of the door and into the cold. Sometimes he closed the door by nudging it with his elbow, or even by leaning into it with his shoulder. This morning he let it swing half open for an extra few seconds, and then kicked it closed with his left boot, the one with the lace still intact. The cold air closed his nostrils and burned his throat. He put both pails down and pulled his arms up in the sleeves of his coat as far as he could, so that there would be a bit of sleeve between the skin of his fingers and the metal handles of the pails. He stepped off the porch, and before he had taken 3 steps, he understood what had happened. The sleigh was gone, its telltale traces in the dust of snow leading away from the house and turning right onto the Waterloo Road. Malachi stopped dead in his tracks and bent over as if he'd been kicked in the stomach. He could feel tears welling up in his eyes. He felt a pain he could neither describe nor bear, and if he had, at that moment, been given the option of death, he would instantly have taken it. When he finally straightened his back and started shuffling towards the spring, he moved as if walking in his sleep, hardly conscious of his actions. In his mind, the same phrase repeated itself over and over and over. "They went without me." It was only on the way back from the spring, his fingertips frozen, his arms sore, his left pant leg stiff with ice from water which had splashed over the bucket's rim, that the simple phrase expanded. And when it did, it was like the explosion of gases in the firing chamber of a rifle. It was an explosion. It was a short lifetime of pain and hurt and anger and injustice that filled his mind with sound and smoke and fury. The death of his mother and then the disappearance of his father, the sudden separation from his sisters and brother, his Aunt Rachel and Uncle Sean, who never missed an opportunity to let him know what a burden he was. And today, a Saturday he'd been looking forward to for months, a Saturday he had been promised, a Saturday on which he would again see, even if only for a brief few minutes, his sister Colleen and maybe Siobhan as well. A Saturday. Then he was home. Not his home, but what he was forced to call home. He almost walked past the house, his mind was so full of confusion. He stopped a moment and put the pails down. He had no idea how long ago his aunt had told him 5 minutes or no breakfast, but suddenly it seemed a long time. The sky was light, and there was already a bit of traffic on the road. He hadn't been alone at the spring either. Still on the road, where the drive entered towards the house, he put the pails down and flexed his fingers to bring back some blood. He clasped his hands together to try to give them some warmth. He stood for a moment, staring at the house as if he had never seen it before. Then he saw his aunt at the window, pulling the white transparent curtain to one side to look out, to look for him. And then his eyes met hers, and he saw her scowl with anger and impatience, and a moment later she was at the door yelling at him. He bent his knees and reached down with his cold hands to pick up his load, and at the same moment heard the yelling stop and the door bang closed. He straightened again, but without the pails. Then, his body acting entirely of its own accord, as if it belonged to someone else, he tipped one pail and then the other, and with only half a load walked the last dozen paces to the house. His aunt was nowhere near the door when he came in, and he put down the 2 half-full pails. She was at the stove, throwing in another block of wood. She banged the firebox closed, and turned on him, her eyes as red as flames. "Where you been, you ragamuffin? All this time I've been waiting for you. Get those pails over here, but get your boots off first." Malachi, and again it felt as if his body belonged to someone else, stood stock still and stared at her as if she were a total stranger he'd never before seen. "Well, hurry up," she screamed. "Ain't got all day. What's wrong with you?" Malachi heard himself speak. His words surprised him as much as they did his Aunt Rachel. "Here's your water," he said, and then he kicked one and then the second pail over, spilling the precious water over the kitchen floor. He didn't hear her words, and he was strangely unmoved by her rage. Even when she started to move towards him with her hand upraised, he didn't cringe or flinch. He was surprised to find a broom in his hands and to see her stop with a look of surprise on her face. For a moment the two stood apart in silence, separated by the thin film of water that was spreading slowly across the floor. And then she spoke. "When your uncle gets home." Malachi threw the broom at her, spun on his heels, and went out the door. It took him several minutes to realize what had happened, what he had done. He found himself walking in the opposite direction of the spring along the Waterloo Road. He didn't know what he would do next, but he knew he would never return to that house. His uncle would be only too glad to beat him with a stick or to whip him with his leather belt. And worse would be Joe, who was older and bigger and stronger, and with the unspoken consent accorded by his parents' anger, would beat him further with his fists. Malachi walked in the cold air, past the crossroad leading to the bridge, past the general store, past the post office. A few minutes after he passed the feed mill, he was aware of a team coming up behind him. He saw the two big Belgians, a man with a kindly face bundled under a buffalo robe, and a sled loaded with bags of feed. As the sled passed him, he ran after it and clambered on. This was a common enough game. Lots of children played it, to hitch a ride on a sleigh or a wagon for a few hundred yards. He had been seen by the man, or perhaps the man had noticed the extra weight on the sled. He turned from where he was and gave Malachi a small smile, as if to say, "I know the game, and played it myself when I was young." The man turned his attention back to the road and his horses. Malachi, at the back of the sled, made himself comfortable among the bags of feed, and like the man, looked at the road ahead. They'd gone a good mile when the man turned back to Malachi and asked, "Where are you going?" "I'm going with you," said Malachi. "Yes," said the man, who understood a joke when he heard one. "But where are you going?" "I'm going with you," repeated Malachi, who wasn't joking at all. The man looked at Malachi for a long moment, unsure what to do. The horses kept up their steady gait, and another mile passed, and then another, and another after that. And when they got to the man's barn and unhitched the horses and unloaded the bags of feed and met the man's wife, it was dinner time. Malachi stayed for dinner, and for supper, and then for the night. In the end, he stayed with the man and his wife until they grew old and passed away, and Malachi continued on with the farm and met a young woman and raised a family and saw his grandchildren born. And, if he had lived a little longer, he might also have seen me, for Malachi was my great-grandfather. I don't know how much of the story is true, but it's been with me a long time, and, like my name, was handed down to me as I now hand it on to you.